Hello again, everyone. It's Adam Capek again here with the first of the talks that I'm putting under the broad umbrella of why are we all stuck indoors. And for this talk, I thought we could just talk about the simple question of what is the NHS. Now, if you ever want to get me excited or passionate or motivated to talk about something, then the NHS is that thing. I see it as a huge privilege to be able to work for this organization, and I think it is one of the things that our country should be most proud about in worldwide terms. It's something where we really do lead the world. But do we all have an understanding about what the NHS actually is, what it stands for, what are the core aims, how is it funded, what's the structure of it? So given how much we're talking about the NHS in the world at the moment, given all of the challenges that the NHS is currently facing, it seems a good place to start. Let's talk about what is the NHS. Now, here's the logo of NHS Scotland. This is the umbrella organisation that covers all of the hospitals, all of the health centres, a lot of dental surgeries, a lot of opticians, places where you or your family or your friends may well end up being treated, and certainly places where I and many, many other people work. So the NHS Scotland logo, now each country within the UK, so England, Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, they each have their own NHS, but ultimately they all come under the even bigger umbrella of the NHS for the UK. What does NHS stand for, though? What do those letters stand for? Well, they stand for the National Health Service. Many of you probably know that already, but I do think it bears repeating. I think it bears repeating this idea that this is a health service for the nation, not just for individuals, but for the whole nation. Every single person living in the country has an entitlement towards healthcare that's delivered by the NHS. But let's go back, well, this is about 120 years or so ago. This is a picture from about 1900. And this is what healthcare may well have looked like back then. You can see that this boy has probably got some kind of an injury. He's got a bandage over his face. Maybe he had a sore tooth, I don't know. And the doctor has come out to his house to visit him. Now, we can still get home visits from doctors today, so there's nothing so strange about that. But what's going on here is that there would have been an exchange of money going on. This boy's family would have paid that doctor to come out and visit him. And what that essentially meant was that if you had money, you could get treated by a doctor, or you could see nurses, you could see midwives. If you didn't have money, then you just had to take your chances. Essentially, there was no healthcare there for you. And if we even look at the hospitals at that time, so this is a picture from my own hospital in about 1900. So this is the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. This is what one of the wards would have looked like back then. Even if you were lucky enough to get a hospital bed, you still had to pay for it. Now, you may work for, say, a factory who had some kind of arrangement with the hospital, and they may be able to get you in there. But ultimately, there was still an exchange of money going on somewhere. And there was still this idea that if you were connected to the hospital in some way, or simply you could pay for it, then you would get treated, and otherwise then you wouldn't. So the majority of the population essentially had no healthcare at all to fall back on. Now, sitting from where we are today in 2020, that seems like a ridiculous state of affairs, a terribly unfair state of affairs, but that is how it was. And if I'm honest, that is how it is in a number of countries around the world to this day. But then we jump forward to about 1948. Now, in those years between, say, about 1900 and 1948, a huge number of things had happened. For a start, the Second World War had just finished in about 1945. That had caused huge poverty in the country, a huge number of people who were sick and injured. But for all of those years, people had been discussing how unfair the healthcare in the country seemed to be. If you had money, you got it. If you didn't have money, you didn't. So these discussions had been ongoing for some time. What else was happening in the country in 1948? Well, some good news events. The Olympics was held in London in 1948. Possibly even more importantly, the Stoke Mandeville Games happened in 1948. Now, this was the forerunner to the Paralympics. This was largely for servicemen who'd been injured, often with spinal injuries, and they decided to have this series of competitive games for them. And this leapt forward into the Paralympics of today. The Land Rover was released in 1948. I mean, it still looks remarkably like things you see pootling about country lanes to this day. But anyway, that's what else was going on in the world. And fairly importantly, this chap was born. Now, this is a picture of the christening of Prince Charles with his mum, the Queen, and his dad, Prince Philip there. But something else very important was happening in 1948, and this chap was the health secretary. This guy is called Nye Bevan. As I say, a lot of work had been going on in the background, but Nye Bevan and the government of the day, they really brought together, they consolidated all of those ideas about how healthcare could be run, and they brought it forward and launched this great new concept of the National Health Service. This was published in all of the newspapers of the time. It was essentially a statement explaining what this new thing would be to all of the country's population. And it had a few key aims. In fact, it had 3 key aims, and these are still the significant aims of the health service as we see it today. The first of those was that it has to meet the needs of everyone. So this is no longer healthcare for the lucky few. This is healthcare for every single person in the country. Now, that is a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge today, and it was a huge challenge in 1948, but that is right at the core of what the NHS stands for. The second one was that it should be free at the point of delivery. Now, that's not to say this is a completely free system. We all pay for it in some way, largely through taxation. But at the point of getting care, there is no exchange of money. So whether you're a millionaire or whether you're someone who's homeless and has nothing in the bank, it makes no difference. You can get the same care. And that brings us forward to the next point, which is that the care is based on your need for the care, not on your ability to pay for it. So we are able to look at people's health problems, prioritize them, and treat them according to the severity of their health problems, not the size of their bank balance. So let's jump forward another fair few years, and let's look at the NHS in Scotland today. What is the state of play with it? Well, the first thing to say is it's very expensive. So the budget for the NHS in Scotland is about £13.4 billion per year. That is a lot of those £100 notes that you're seeing on the screen. And that money comes from taxation. So every time you earn some money in a job, some of that money goes to the government as tax. Every time you buy pretty well anything, there's some VAT or value added tax on it, and that money goes to the government. And the government is then able to take all of that money and decide, what are we going to spend on healthcare? What are we going to spend on education? What are we going to spend on the roads? And all of those other things that the government needs to be responsible for. But about 42% of that money is given to healthcare. That's how significant a priority healthcare is within the nation. So that 42% becomes that £13.4 billion that is then divvied out to the different health boards. Now, each region in the country has its own health board. The one I work in, the one that's close to my heart, is Greater Glasgow and Clyde. You'll see it with the pointer there. Now, it's interesting that it's the smallest geographical area by health board terms, but it's actually the largest in Scotland in terms of population because of the density of the population in this area. There's 14 regions which are covered there, and you might notice that there's a 15th one just down there. Now, that's the Golden Jubilee National Hospital. Now, that is based in Clydebank, but it takes patients from all over the country to try and really get through the waiting lists. So if the waiting lists are building up in one part of the country, those patients can be brought down to Clydebank and can get their treatment, particularly surgical treatment. They can get that there. So the money that the government has for healthcare, that £13.4 billion, that then gets divided up to all of these health boards, and they can then spend it on the areas that they think are their key priorities. And furthermore, so once the health boards have got the money, they can then divide that further into primary care. Now, that's like these GP surgeries you might see. So that's when you go to your general practitioner. We think of primary healthcare as really the first line of defense in healthcare. So they are able to pick up problems in the community before they're a major issue. And that could be chronic health problems. So it could be high blood pressure or asthma or diabetes, or it might be a more acute problem. So they're able to see someone with their tummy pain and diagnose them with maybe mild appendicitis and then send them on for treatment before they've got a major problem. And where they would send that person for treatment is to secondary care. Now, secondary care is essentially what we'd think of as hospital care, where there are different specialties to look after all the different body systems, and they can then treat significant problems. So it's an important part of the structure of the NHS that it's divided into primary and secondary healthcare. And that's not even really touching upon some of the other areas that I've mentioned, so like dentistry and opticians and that kind of stuff. Now, then this brings us on to this beast. You may well have seen pictures like this in the press recently. This is a representation of what coronavirus looks like. And coronavirus is probably giving the NHS one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge it's ever faced in all of those years since 1948. The reasons for that, well, they're multiple. But let's think about the health service like we might think about a school. So picture a school. Say that it's set up so that there'll be 25 children per class. Now, obviously, everything will be accounted for 25 children per class. So they'll have 25 desks, 25 seats in each room. They'll have 25 textbooks for each class. They'll have space in the playground for that number of pupils. Now say to that head teacher and say to those class teachers, actually, we're going to put 50 pupils in each class. You can see what a strain that would put on that school and on that education system. Ultimately, coronavirus is giving the same problems to the NHS. Now, this is a virus that many people will clear. Some people won't even get any symptoms from it, but clearly some people will become very unwell with it. And that is a challenge to the health service because it's now having to look after greater numbers of sick people than it was ever really predicting to have to look after. So undoubtedly there are stresses there. But what I would say to you is this. The NHS was there long before coronavirus, and the NHS will be there long after coronavirus. Now, we are undergoing significant strain at the moment. It's putting pressure on the hospitals, it's putting pressure on the staff, but these are pressures that the health service will be able to overcome. Just like that school with 50 pupils per class rather than 25, it'll be a stress, but they'll still be able to deliver education. They'll still get people through the school system. Let's picture the NHS currently in similar terms. We will still be able to deliver healthcare. We will still be able to look after people, and we'll still be able to have good outcomes. But we all need to protect it and look after it and recognize the stress that it's going through. So I hope that's been interesting. I hope that gives you some background as to what the NHS is, why it's something I'm so passionate about, because I really do believe a system of fair healthcare is absolutely fundamental to a civilized society. And I hope it gives you some appreciation of why the NHS is undergoing significant stress at the moment, but why it will ultimately overcome it. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed that, and I'll be back with another talk soon. Cheers.